So far, in our discussions of the divergence debates, we have considered the relative importance of two fundamental channels: the impact of geography via its impact on climate, disease environment, and productivity, versus the role of historical institutions, specifically differences arising in colonial institutions between settler and non settler colonies, and the resulting divergence in economic outcomes. In this short video, I want to present a different fundamental channel: the role of state policy. Consider the following. Regardless of which fundamental channel you prefer, the geography or the historical institutional hypothesis, what is common to both sets of explanations is the idea that one or another time invariant factor, something that cannot be changed in the present, that is ultimately responsible for current development. This implicitly leads to the view that third world countries are essentially prisoners of birth. Development paths are predetermined by a country's geography or historical institutions. But is this really true? And how useful is such a framework for economic policy, which is ultimately interested in the present and the future, not the past? One way of reframing this debate could be to ask a slightly different question. Say two countries that had an identical geography or colonial history came into existence on the same day. Given our current development models, geography or institutional, what would be our best prediction in terms of how these countries would evolve over time? If our models are consistent, we should expect the two countries to converge over time since their fundamental channels are identical. But has this necessarily always been the case? The answer is an emphatic no. To see this, we can rely on natural experiments of countries that were partitioned between two or more countries at the moment of their independence. If we could examine these countries and why they diverged or converged over time, we can learn much more about the nuances of economic development. Specifically, we can begin to develop some analysis of what sets of policies work and what don't. In a sense, this way of looking at the problem is very similar to the nature versus nurture debate in the behavioral sciences. In a sense, when comparing partitioned economies, we are conducting a twin study. Twins, as you know, share the same genes. If they are separated at birth and exposed to different environments, we can then study empirically the extent to which behavioral outcomes are dependent on their genes, i.e., nature, versus nurture. One such example of a twin study of countries that I mentioned earlier in the semester was South versus North Korea. The people who live on either side of this peninsula inherited almost identical institutions and geography. Yet, their economic outcomes have diverged significantly over time. But are there other examples of this that we can study, particularly from British colonies? My own research focused on one such twin study from the partitioned region of Punjab in South Asia. The Punjab region, one of the most fertile agrarian belts in the world, was divided between India and Pakistan in 1947 purely along religious lines. A large number of people were forced to migrate to one or another country purely on the basis of their religious identities. Millions of people perished during this long journey. The partition of Punjab, therefore, is rightly considered one of the worst man made disasters in history. The two regions, Indian and Pakistani Punjab, share an identical language, Punjabi, culture, geography, and of course, historical colonial institutions. As such, they present us with an ideal natural experiment setting to compare economic outcomes over time. I took up this theme in my research entitled The Colonial and Post Colonial Origins of Development. The post colonial adjective, of course, was a reminder that state policy is as important as geography and historical institutions. What I did, essentially, was to go back to archival records of colonial institutions set up by the British in every district of Punjab. In a sense, this gave me a sense of the initial historical conditions that I was dealing with. It was my control for nature. Now, I won't bore you with all the econometric details and methodologies, but an overview of the comparison will make the point clear. Here's what I found. Punjab, India, and Punjab, Pakistan have diverged significantly. As you can see, the GDP per capita on the Indian side is about 4 times higher than the Pakistani side. The literacy rate, likewise, is much higher on the Indian side as compared to the Pakistani side. More than twice as many infants will die before reaching the age of 5 on the Pakistani side of Punjab. Twice as many mothers will die during the process of childbirth. Despite its much smaller area, the Indian side of Punjab has a greater proportion of metalled roads. All of this combined has meant that while the poverty rate on the Indian side of Punjab, as measured by the $2 line, is about 5%, the same number stands at a much higher rate on the Pakistani side of Punjab. This obviously begs the natural question, what caused the divergence despite identical geographies and identical histories? The answer has to do with post colonial state policy. While Pakistan chose a path of totalitarianism and lack of democracy, India became one of the largest and vibrant democracies in the world today. Soon after independence, the Indian Republic conducted a massive land reform, bringing an end to the power of landlords and feudals. Pakistan did not. India became a secular society. Pakistan chose a theocratic path. India promoted state intervention. Pakistan chose a liberal, laissez faire market economy. And these differences, not geographic, not historical, ultimately resulted, within the course of 7 decades, in economic divergence. I now want to turn to our discussion question of the day. Let's revisit Ben Fine's article and turn to the discussion on page 114 to 115. Ben Fine wants us to think about 6 specific questions about the nature of the state and its link with economic policy and outcomes over time. What is his central argument? Why does he want us to revisit the link between classes, economic policy, and the state? What lessons does one learn that these differences may matter not only for comparisons across countries, but also comparisons across states within the US?